Welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. 25 years ago, the world was coming to grips with the catastrophe unfolding at Chernobyl. Today, the same could be said about Fukushima. What is the future of nuclear power? Has it run its course, or is it inevitable that it will be with us for a very long time? To crosstalk the pros and cons of nuclear energy, I'm joined by William Tucker in New York. He's a journalist and author of Terrestrial Energy. In Paris, we cross to Benjamin Sovakool. He is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. He is also author of the forthcoming book, Contesting the Future of Nuclear Power, a critical global assessment of atomic energy. And in Austin, we have Robert Bryce. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. All right, gentlemen, this is Crosstalk. That means you can jump in. Since it's the 25th anniversary of the tragedy at Chernobyl, let's take a look back.
The town of Chernobyl in northern Ukraine is destined to stay abandoned. Its high radiation levels and decaying infrastructure serve as a reminder of the worst nuclear plant disaster in human history. Since then, nuclear technologies have been modernized significantly. To survive the accident of the scale, the industry was virtually forced to reinvent itself through breeding a new safety culture. Nevertheless, those who oppose the use of nuclear energy will always play the Chernobyl card because the damage caused is hard to forget. 31 people were killed by the Chernobyl accident in the first 3 months, but many more died later as a result of radiation-related sickness. The impact on public health remains an issue to this day. Radioactive contamination spread over about 40% of Europe and turned the Chernobyl blast into an international tragedy. Today, only tourists are permitted to enter the exclusion zone, but there are extreme health risks when doing so. Though proponents claim nuclear technologies have become much more sophisticated, they're still vulnerable to natural disasters. The earthquake and tsunami that recently hit Japan turned the city of Fukushima into a dead zone because of radiation levels. Fukushima's severity level was raised to 7, the same as Chernobyl. Some experts remain steadfast in the face of Chernobyl and Fukushima and continue to think nuclear.
The only major energy source that is available when oil starts missing and running short is nuclear power, and we better get prepared for it.
Many European countries continue to heavily rely on nuclear power. In France, for example, it amounts to 75% of its electricity needs. Chernobyl seriously undermined the nuclear industry, and many countries refused to build more nuclear power plants. But resistance soon gave way to what many call a nuclear renaissance, with more countries opting for nuclear energy. The same may happen in light of Fukushima. It may encourage a global rethink, but the world is unlikely to rule out the nuclear option anytime soon. Inessa Petrova for CrossTalk, RT.
Okay, William Tucker in New York, if I can go to you first. Is Fukushima a black eye for the industry, or is it a knockout? And because of the severity of the accident, and it's going to be with us for quite a while still.
Yeah, I think it's a black eye. It's definitely not a knockout. Most countries are not going to abandon nuclear. Those that do are putting themselves in a real bind. I mean, you already see Germany is floundering around. What are we going to do next if we abandon nuclear? Italy has the highest electrical costs in Europe, and they think they're going to abandon it. I think countries will react to different degrees. Some may quit altogether, but those that move ahead, I think, are going to reap the advantages eventually.
Benjamin, what do you think about that in Paris? I mean, this is a second really serious accident here, and as much as people talk about new technologies, we still have the same kind of critical level of danger. 7. Okay, we had it 25 years ago. We have it now. Okay, and that's all with a nuclear technology that has been improved. Others will say this was an old plant, but nonetheless, tragedy is out there, and when it happens big.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that needs corrected is that, Fukushima and Chernobyl aren't the only major nuclear accidents. If you use the INES scale, it's true that these are the only two that are level 7, but we did a longitudinal study of 100 years of energy accidents at my own university, and we found that there are 103 significant nuclear incidents or accidents that either resulted in a fatality or caused more than $1 million of damages. So the question of will this be a black eye to the nuclear industry is probably not, because the industry is very used to dealing with incidents and accidents, but this is also a pretty big disadvantage to nuclear power. These facilities are so large, so expensive, they tend to lock in different decisions. So even if Japan wanted right now to kind of abandon nuclear power plants, they can't, because they've built an infrastructure that is so capital intensive that switching trajectories because of any reasons, disaster, shortages of fuel, high costs, is virtually impossible, which is something that you don't see with your energy efficiency measures or your renewable energy technologies, which are quicker, cheaper, and more widely available.
Robert, if I can go to you, are we locked into a nuclear future? We don't even have a choice right now, do we?
Well, I agree more with Bill, I think, than with Benjamin. The fact is, for the near term, Fukushima is going to hinder nuclear development globally. But look at what's happening in China, a country that is heavily reliant on coal for about 75% of its electricity. They're planning to build 60 new nuclear reactors over the next decade. It's clear that in the near term, the accident at Fukushima is going to drive the world more toward natural gas, because that's the only other source that is scalable and as relatively low carbon. But over the long term, I think nuclear is going to have to be and will be part of the answer, because the demand for electricity globally is so great.
Well, if I go back to New York, William, what about the cost of it? I mean, when I was preparing for this program, it's just such a politicized issue. I come across articles that say everything's just fine, this is just a black eye, the future is bright and radiant, and then other stuff saying these plants they're getting old, there's not enough new ones being built, they're extremely expensive, they're actually not very efficient, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's very intensely debated. It's been debated all of our lives here. I mean, is it just going to continue on in the way it is, because it's just going to always be a certain percentage of our energy needs, like 20%, 24%, whoever you're listening to?
Right. Well, I don't think you can say existing plants are inefficient. They're running at about 90% capacity, which is the best of any energy source, and they're also immensely profitable. The average reactor in the United States is making about $2 million a day, because they have their construction costs retired, and now they're just making money. The difficulty is that we've had this hiatus where we haven't built anything for 25 years. It looks expensive. It costs $5 billion to build one reactor, but look at the alternatives. If you try to duplicate that amount of power with windmills, you would spend more. Natural gas looks cheap because they're easy to build, but who knows what the price of natural gas is going to do.
Benjamin, that seems like a reasonable comment there. I mean, they're profitable. And I want to talk a little bit about energy security in the future. I mean, irrespective if they're expensive to make, they're each country's. A country can't turn off your electricity. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, there are a few points. The first is that Bill's right that the current plants that are operating are very profitable, but we're not talking about building new plants, which is prone to costs that are incredibly high, costs that could be as high as $8,000 to $9,000 per installed kilowatt. Cost of building a new wind turbine is about $2,000 per installed kilowatt. The only other technology that's that expensive on a capital-intensive basis is solar panels, and nobody's talked about making centralized solar facilities, at least not many countries. The second interesting point is that when you talk about capacity factor, it is true that most plants in the U.S. are actually close to 96, 97% for the last few years. But if you look at the worldwide history over the course of nuclear power, the global capacity factor is below 70%. And that's largely due to what's called a steep technological learning curve with new reactors. And so if we're talking about historic reactors, keeping the reactors online, they're cheap.
That's the point.
William, go ahead.
For generation 3 or 4 reactors.
William, go ahead. Jump in. Go ahead.
Well, if you get to when you get to the top of the learning curve, you don't want to quit. Then that's where you've got. That's the point.
Benjamin?
I mean, the best example
Peter,
of, I guess,
if I
a
can
new
jump in
reactor
for a
being
second,
built
I think
right
that
now.
Okay, Benjamin, go ahead, and then I'll go to Robert. Go ahead, finish your point.
No,
Benjamin, go ahead, finish your point.
The newest reactor being built right now, which is a kind of generation 3+, is the European pressurized reactor. There's one being built in Finland and I believe one in Sweden. And this illustrates the complexity and the difficulty with doing a new nuclear design. Both of these projects are 4 to 5 years behind schedule and have seen cost overruns of 200 to 400%. So this idea that we've already surpassed the learning curve with even slight modifications of reactor designs, I think is completely a false argument.
Okay, Robert, jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I think this is, Peter, this is clearly the issue is how is the nuclear industry going to address the cost issue going forward? And this, make no mistake, this is the real problem that the industry faces. The capital cost for these plants is at minimum $5,000 per installed kilowatt, and as Benjamin pointed out, can be much higher given cost inflation. But the reality is we just have to get good at nuclear. Right now, I just looked up the numbers, the world's fleet of 400 reactors or so is avoiding about 2.5 billion tons of CO2 emissions per year. That's nearly 10% of global CO2 emissions. So if we're concerned about CO2, we have to embrace nuclear. I think that going forward, we have a lot of options going to smaller, what are called modular reactors, possibly fueling them with thorium to reduce proliferation risks. That combination of technologies can help bring the price down. You go to a manufacturing type of base of production rather than a bespoke or on-site construction methodology. That could help bring costs down. But in my view, if you're anti-carbon dioxide and you're anti-nuclear, you're just pro-blackout. And with global demand for electricity expected to grow by 80% over the next 20 or 25 years, we simply don't have an option but to continue to work hard at getting good at nuclear.
All righty, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break here right now. After that break, we'll continue our discussion on the use of nuclear power. Stay with RT.
"25 years of fallout. From the most devastating nuclear disaster in history. A quarter of a century on, has mankind learned from its mistakes? The legacy of Chernobyl on RT.
Download the official RT application to your iPhone or iPod Touch from the iTunes App Store. Watch RT live on the go. Video on demand, RT's live broadcasts, and RSS feeds now in the palm of your hand. Question more on RT.com. Hungry for the full story? We've got it firsthand. The biggest issues get a human voice, face to face with the newsmakers on RT.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the future of nuclear energy. Benjamin, if I go back to you in Paris, I mean, irrespective of your attitude towards nuclear energy, one thing is for sure. Demand for energy is going to continue to grow, especially in China, was already mentioned in the program. As we speak right now, there's a lot of controversy about nuclear power plants being built in India, and another market that desperately needs more energy. And we live in a very volatile world, gentlemen. I mean, the politics of oil, the geopolitics of oil is out there in our face. Now, we don't know what the world's going to be like in 20 years, 25 years, but everybody has to plan for their energy security. So, Benjamin, what about that? I mean, irrespective if you like nuclear power or not, a lot of countries just feel compelled to go in that direction because it'll be their energy.
There's a lot to unpack with that comment. First, I think Bill's soundbite that it's you're either pro-nuclear or pro-blackout is brilliant. It's a great comment, but it kind of illustrates the completely false dichotomy that it's either nuclear power or fossil fuels. If you look, including at China and India, in the past 5 years, both the fastest growing sources of new electricity supply as well as the cheapest have all been renewable electricity in both Europe and the US. It's been natural gas, wind, and landfill gas. Globally, it's been hydro, geothermal, wind, as well as solar electricity. Even in China, you had about 6 times more renewable energy capacity installed last year. The nuclear capacity, if you look at global investment patterns, you had $185 billion invested on renewables. You had about 6 last year invested on new nuclear reactors. So you can kind of already see the market is choosing to meet increases in electricity demand with renewable sources as well as energy efficiency. What's interesting is if you look at what cuts carbon the fastest, right, as in what does the most bang for the buck, about an 8-to-1 ratio favorable to nuclear energy is energy efficiency. This is, things that you can implement, demand-side management practices, more efficient homes, more efficient, fuel standards for vehicles that cut energy costs far below the price of building any new power plant. And you may think that countries like Japan or the US or China haven't really tapped this energy efficiency potential, or they have tapped it, when in reality you've got probably 30 to 50% of electricity demand today can be cut with cost-effective measures. And these are numbers that don't just come from industry trade groups, but also consulting groups like McKinsey or the IPCC just released a report a few months ago. So this issue of we have to build more power plants to meet demand rather than let's actually reduce the demand first is another one of these kind of dichotomies that kind of distorts the real picture of the options that countries have to meet energy security needs.
Yeah, but William, if I can go to you, I mean, I don't know how inefficient countries like let's say India is, but it certainly has the desire to have its own energy independence here, and nuclear is one direction there. Like I said, what's going to happen to oil? I mean, obviously they're going to still want oil and gas, but this is something for a longer term because the plants last longer, the investment is huge, and as we've been told on this program, they're hugely profitable. So again, kind of repeating my question, I mean, countries like that really don't have an option. They really feel they need to take the nuclear option for their own energy self-sufficiency.
Yeah. Well, the thing we always talk about with nuclear power is its energy density. You get 2,000 times the energy from the same volume than you do with coal. And I came across a figure the other day, it really amazed me. There are something like 2,000 coal mines in the entire world. There's 400 coal mines alone in Kentucky. There are 45 uranium mines around the world right now. Russia is talking about supplying all the developing countries with uranium on this exchange basis. They have one uranium mine. It's all going to come out of one mine. So you get such a tremendous advantage when you go with nuclear. And of course, there's uranium everywhere. So really, for countries that want to supply their own energy, nuclear is just ideal.
Robert Bryce,
Whoa.
Okay, all righty, Benjamin, that's what this program is. So let Benjamin, you dissented. Go ahead, Benjamin, go ahead, and then we'll go to Robert.
Sorry, and then it's only that it's interesting that if you're talking about energy security and fuel availability, uranium isn't everywhere. You've got 3 countries, Kazakhstan, Canada, and Australia, that are responsible for more than 60% of production, and you've got about 12 countries that are responsible for 90% of production. So it's even as concentrated in terms of supply as oil is. So we'd be really kind of replacing one set of dependence with another set of dependence.
Okay, Robert. I mean, let's go down the road here of renewables, because a lot of people are saying, again, I've come across very different numbers about the efficiency of investment in renewables as compared to fossil fuel and nuclear energy.
Sure. Well, to Benjamin's point about efficiency, look, no one is opposed to efficiency. Saying you'd be opposed to efficiency is akin to saying I'm opposed to air. The world is getting more efficient in its energy consumption. It's happening everywhere. The U.S. is now today using about the same amount of oil as it did in 1973, despite the fact that we have twice as many cars and we're driving them at twice as many miles. So I'm all for efficiency, but we can't keep the lights on with efficiency. We have to generate electricity. Why? Because we don't have a perfect storage method for electricity. If we had such a method, then that is the true game changer. But with regard to renewables, look at just the latest report from the Energy Information Administration here in the United States. they estimated natural gas-fired electricity is about the cheapest form of power production at about $63 per megawatt hour. Onshore wind generated electricity costs 50% more. Offshore wind costs 4 times as much, and solar thermal costs 5 times as much. This idea that renewables are cheaper than conventional forms of electricity generation is just simply not true. Further, even if it were on par, they're not dispatchable. The reality is we need electricity generation sources that we can turn on and off. That's what gives them value. Having them be intermittent and highly variable gives them a real-world value of essentially zero. But I think, Peter, just to direct the conversation, if I could, one idea, I think the bigger problem for nuclear going forward is the issue of global cooperation with regard to the fuel cycle. This is it addresses the issue of proliferation. One of the first responders after Fukushima was the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA and the enabling, the empowering, the funding of the IAEA is going to be critical for the growth of nuclear globally in the next couple of decades.
What do you think about that, William? I mean, since it's what kind of global cooperation we're going to have here. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me throw in about the renewables. You're going to hit, with all these renewables, you're going to hit a point of diminishing returns very quickly. You can throw up a lot of windmills at first to get up to maybe 5–10% of your electricity. But after that, the wind's fluctuation is going to start impacting the grid. And at that point, it becomes a nuisance more than anything else. So what happens is you have to put up natural gas turbines so you can compensate for that. And as Robert Bryce has pointed out, once you start doing that, it would be much more efficient to run baseload combined cycle gas plants at just running the gas itself than putting up the windmills and having these inefficient turbines. You end up using more gas with windmills than you would without windmills.
What do you think about that, Benjamin? I mean, because I'd like to go back to something that was said earlier in the program about learning curve. I mean, have we reached the top of the learning curve for renewables? I mean, it's a relatively new idea, at least for commercial use and industrial use.
I mean, not really. The one big advantage that renewables have in terms of learning curves is more rapid turnover, right? It takes 2 to 3, 4, maybe 4 years at most to build a new wind farm. You've got, pre-assembled, pre-modulated, pre-manufactured components for a lot of these types of facilities, as opposed to nuclear plants, which take 10 to 15 years to build if you include permitting. So the ability for us to learn more rapidly and to integrate that learning into new designs is much quicker when you have technologies that are like cell phones rather than technologies that are like cathedrals. The other key thing about cost, the elephant in the room, which no one has mentioned, is subsidies and externalities. The reason nuclear power seems so cheap is because most of its development has been subsidized. You have a nuclear sector that's eating 3/4 of all global research subsidies related to energy going back for 50 years, and externalities. We're talking about all of these things, the hazardous pollutants with uranium mining, limited liability for nuclear accidents, free on-site storage of fuel, decommissioning of facilities that are always excluded from nuclear costs. If you include them, the price of nuclear often doubles, or in some cases even triples. So let's be honest about what we're actually including and not including when we talk about the cost of generating a certain type of electricity.
William, if I go to we did a program on energy about a few months ago, and we had a gentleman on from France, and he obviously was trumpeting the nuclear industry in France, but it was brought up that it's intensely subsidized by the state, intensely.
Well, construction of nuclear plants was never subsidized. The actual construction was never subsidized in the United States. It was built under the old regime where the utilities were guaranteed a profit, but there were never any government subsidies. Now, if you want to look for subsidies, just try the windmills, the production taxes, the investment taxes, the mandates. Whoever mandated that anybody had to build a nuclear reactor. So on the cost of reactors, most of those costs are incorporated. The whole business of taking care of fuel has been, we've got a $20 billion pot of money waiting to build Yucca Mountain or something like that. All that has already been incorporated.
What about that, Robert? All energy is subsidized by somebody, and it's almost always the taxpayer.
Well, that's true. Depending on who you ask, there's no such thing as a free market. That's certainly true in the energy business. But when it comes to the growth of renewables in places like China, if you look at what has happened here in the U.S., and in fact, if you look at the clean energy, the clean energy mechanism that was mandated under some of these UN rules, and then go back and look at China, it's clear that that system has been gamed, and the Chinese have been among the best at collecting these subsidies to build wind projects, that some of which are not even connected to the grid. So this idea that somehow investment in renewables is leading the world, that this is where the world is going in chasing renewables in most of these countries simply because of subsidies and mandates. It's not because the market is saying this is the best option. Benjamin gave us one number before of something on the order of $200 billion invested in renewables. Okay, well, that seems like a big number. Here in the U.S., the upstream oil and gas industry alone, just in drilling new wells every year, spends $250 billion. So the idea that somehow that the world is moving to renewables because this is the cheapest, fastest way, it's simply not true. It's because it's subsidized and mandated that they're going to these inefficient and incredibly resource-intensive projects, particularly like wind, that uses up to 50 times more land than nuclear or natural gas, and by my calculations, about 500 times.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to have to jump in here. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in New York, Austin, and in Paris, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here on RT. See you next time, and remember, Crosstalk rules.